There are really two big ideas that we need to keep in mind when applying critical realism to our investigations of the social world. First, we social scientists cannot conduct scientific experiments in the strict same sense that our counterparts in the natural sciences can. The reason is that the social world is always an open system. We social scientists cannot do what physicists and chemists are readily able to do within the confines of their laboratories, namely, close the system to isolate causal mechanisms and, as it were, to open an empirical window in order to identify them. Even with the best of efforts, social systems will remain stubbornly open precisely because they always inherently involve people. And because we are reflexive beings, we will always find a way of acting autonomously in any given situation, even in allegedly controlled experiments. For this reason, when it comes to social phenomena, we cannot, and come to think of it, we should not aim to achieve experimental closure. Aside from contending with ethical questions about subjecting humans to experiments, we have to acknowledge that the unattainability of closure in the social world rules out experimental activity as a warranted method in the social sciences. Hence, experimental activity is undoubtedly a staple in the natural sciences, but its counterpart in the social sciences is conceptual and theoretical abstraction. Moreover, by virtue of the open system, a phenomenon should not be studied in isolation from others. Most phenomena in the social world have multiple causal mechanisms that interact with one another. For this reason, for our causal explanations to be adequate, more often than not, they need to be multi-causal. The second big idea in the realist practice of the social sciences is that the examination of any social phenomenon ought to be constantly mindful of the distinctions and dependencies between structures, cultures, and agents. First of all, we need to correctly identify whether a phenomenon under investigation is a form of structure, agency, or culture, because each of these is distinct with irreducible properties that should not be confused or conflated with the others. It is important to differentiate these causal powers since they operate on different timescales and have autonomous causal powers. The challenge, therefore, is to identify which one is doing the pushing at T1. Our ability to differentiate them correctly will aid us in our crucial task of concept formation. Just as importantly, our explanatory accounts must reflect the mutual dependency between agency on the one hand and structure or culture on the other. After all, as we've so often stressed, there is no such thing as an unconditioned action. Now, Archer's explanatory framework, the morphogenetic approach, is a toolkit that can help us make sense of this unique interdependence and interplay among structure, agency, and culture. We have discussed in the previous lecture how social conditions, whether structure or culture, impinge on agency, and how agency engages in reflexive deliberations in order to act back, leading ultimately to either social stability or change. We have seen how Archer's concept of situational logic helps us unpack this interplay between structure and culture and agency. In short, we have structural or cultural conditioning, then we have situational logic that leads to reflexivity, then action, then structural or cultural outcome. I hope by now it's clear to us that according to Archer's realist social theory, it's considered a mortal sin to jump directly from conditioning to action and outcome, from T1 to T2 to T3 and T4. For example, When examining highly bureaucratic and regulatory systems, we can't just say strict bureaucratic red tape causes small businesses to engage in bribery. That's a mortal sin because it implies and assumes a direct causal link. It ignores the fact that not all business owners bribe, and it neglects the important truth that corruption has a systemic nature. A more properly critical realist explanation would sound something like this. Strict bureaucratic red tape imposed by the state provides small enterprises reasons to consider resorting to bribery. Note how the second explanation is much more nuanced than the first. It refuses to rush into making any sort of pronouncements about any automatic impact of bureaucracy on corruption. For a critical realist, it is important to capture the act of consideration and, more often than not, internal struggle experienced by the agents, or what we call the reflexive deliberation, and not simply make it sound like bureaucracy is an independent variable affecting a dependent variable such as bribery. Here's what a fuller account might sound like. Regulatory bureaucracy results in a relationship of necessary incompatibility between the state and the small enterprise. This is conditioning at T1. The relationship is necessary because the state and small enterprise cannot do without the other. It is also incompatible because the state values procedural rigor, which takes time, while the small enterprise desires commercial agility and, of course, an expedited procedure. The situational logic generated is one of compromise. The small business owner weighs the guaranteed opportunity cost of income loss caused by procedural delays against the potential risks of prosecution due to an illegal business operation, and a number of them, but not all, may opt to resort to bribery in order to resolve the stalemate. This is interaction at T2 to T3. The resulting elaboration is morphostasis. The same tedious regulatory bureaucracy is maintained, albeit with a new feature, a compromise solution in the form of an informal fixer system. This is elaboration at T4. In the previous lecture, we discussed both structural conditioning and cultural conditioning, but separately. Those discussions have been confined to relationships between structures, as in the example of capital and labor, and between cultures, as in the case of astronomy and astrology. But what if in some cases there is a mix of both, where structure and culture interact with each other to condition agency? After all, as we have so often emphasized, the social world is an open system, and our causal explanations are consequently almost always multi-causal. So it may be the case that for some of our investigations, what is significant is an interplay between structure and culture. When we are dealing with an interplay between structure and culture, it is important, even before we analyze how they impinge on agency, to look at the directionality of the relationship between the two. Should we examine how structure impinges on culture, or should we be more interested in how culture impinges on structure? Here are two principles to remember when it comes to this interplay of structure and culture. First, structure influences cultural viability. It is structure that allocates or withholds the resources needed for an idea or belief or culture to prevail or even just to exist. Structure influences whether the culture survives by giving or withholding resources. The propagation of ideas and beliefs, after all, require material resources. Here's a case of structure and culture interacting to condition agency. The fossil fuel industry, an example of structure, and the degrowth movement, an example of culture. The fossil fuel industry uses its resources to gatekeep which ideas are to be espoused and works very hard to portray the degrowth movement as nothing more than a fringe idea. So we really should be looking at how structure impinges on culture for that particular example. Second principle, culture influences structural legitimacy. It is culture that supplies the justification whether or not a structure has the moral right to exist. Structures need to rely on culture for legitimation. It is culture that influences whether the structure is to be accepted as moral by giving or withholding approval. An example of this would be the doctrine of the divine right of kings and the structure of the monarchy. To legitimize its reign, the monarchy relies on this political theory, which claims that a monarch's right to rule comes directly from God and not from the people, thus substantiating the monarchy's exercise of absolute power. Of course, lately, particularly in the UK, we've seen a case of culture eroding the legitimacy of the monarchy. Due to domestic troubles amplified by intense public scrutiny, there has been a shift in the public perception of the royal family, diminishing its symbolic and political power. So here we see how culture erodes the legitimacy of structure. So when we are examining the interplay between structure and culture, we are really asking the following questions. Can a particular idea, belief, or ideology survive in the material world? If culture sells, or if culture is provided the required resources or platform by the structure, then we have cultural viability. So the structure can either enable culture through funding or promotion, or constrain it through defunding or censorship. Otherwise, the idea can fade or eventually die. Second question, is a structure justified by the ideas, beliefs, or ideology, or culture? If yes, structure acquires legitimacy. If not, we get some kind of crisis of legitimacy. Hence, culture can either justify structure, for example, loyalty, patriotism, or invalidate it through dissent or protest. Actually, in analyzing a morphogenetic process that involves both structure and culture, we can go further. If helpful, we can employ our usual process of identifying the situational logic arising from the relationship between the two, whether compatible or not, necessary or not, and the expected strategic outcomes that agents wrestle with before making the decisions that eventually lead to either reproduction or transformation. So you see, the primary value of Archer's morphogenetic approach lies in the wide array of conceptual tools that it provides, from which we can draw in our investigation of social phenomena and the processes of social change and stability. Now, how does a researcher actually apply Archer's exploratory framework in a concrete investigation? As the researcher, we get to choose what we would like to do, depending on the type of research question that we are asking. There are actually 4 questions we can ask. One question may simply be, how did we get here? Or how did we end up with this setup? In such a case, we could do a full cycle investigation tracing a phenomenon from its origin to its current state, or from T1 to T4. This would be the historical approach. Secondly, we may opt simply to zoom in on a specific phase of the morphogenetic cycle and try to examine the mechanics of that moment. So a second possible question would be, why is it so hard to change this current setup? That would be the diagnostic method. Third, we may want to examine why there are different outcomes given the same situation and problem. And the question we may want to ask is, why did they succeed in their efforts while we failed? And this would be the comparative approach. The fourth option is to extrapolate a future, or to design a desired future, which we will call the new T1, by analyzing the current state of things. For something like this, our question might be, how do we build a system that can work for us? Or simply, how do we solve this problem? So this would be the prescriptive approach. Now let's take one sample research question for each of these approaches. An example of the historical approach might be a topic like the roots of the English-only preference in Philippine education. So to figure out how we got here in this setup, we need to analyze the full cycle from T1 to the current state of T4. A typical research question might sound like this: how did the preference for English as the primary medium of instruction become so deeply embedded in Philippine education? To investigate this question, we cannot just examine the existing curricula or interview contemporary educators. Indeed, our entry point is our current state at T4, but we need to go back to the Philippines-American colonial period and examine the cultural conditioning on the agents, so we can analyze past curriculum debates and determine how strategic victories were won, such as the recent issue of the mother tongue-based instruction. Is the current cultural morphostasis, we may ask, due to perceptions that Filipino is an inferior language and that English proficiency is an unquestionable marker for being elite and educated? If so, which institutional powers and ideologies conditioned this cultural morphostasis that English proficiency is indeed an indicator of being elite and educated? Now let's take an example of a diagnostic investigation where we may want to figure out why some things aren't working. For example, the issue of public school teachers persisting in performing manual data entry despite the introduction of automated reporting systems. Here we may want to zoom in on the structural conditioning of the reporting hierarchy in the Department of Education. What could be some of the vested interests that tend to preserve manual verification? Is there a situational logic of protection benefiting middle management roles that discourage teachers from adopting the digital system of reporting? Here, it might be helpful to identify which agents benefit from the morphostasis and how their vested interests are being promoted. Who loses a sense of control or some kind of self-importance when the manual paperwork is eliminated, making the old way safer or more advantageous? Our next example is the comparative approach. But before that, recall that in the social sciences, we cannot, strictly speaking, conduct experiments to identify causal mechanisms precisely because, as we've been saying, we are dealing with an open system. So to test causal mechanisms, we resort to the comparative method. To do this, we look at a single problem and compare cases that have yielded different outcomes because we want to isolate why similar systems ended up with different results. So our research might be about the implementation of indigenous peoples or IP education in different schools. Our research question could be something like, given the same national mandate for IP education, why are some schools able to integrate the local culture while others remain textbook bound? In this example, all the schools are subjected to a shared structural conditioning of the mandate from the Department of Education. So what we need to examine are the specific differences in agentic response and reflexive deliberation among the school heads and key players that led to cultural transformation in some schools, but only standardization in others. Since the structural conditioning is the same, the answer to the question probably lies in the interaction, highlighting the capacity of agency to respond differently to the same situational logic. For example, did the successful school leaders engage with the local community in a way that the others did not? Our final example involves an investigation that aims to solve a problem. what we are labeling here as the prescriptive approach. Here we are extrapolating for a desired future, a policy or some other intervention that can redesign the conditions for the desired T1. So what we want to do is to reconfigure structural or cultural conditions and to shift the situational logic in order to create new possibilities. In short, we don't just simply propose a solution, or certainly not a quick fix, but we identify the conditions that will create the possibility for the desired change. Given the situational logic arising from the current setup, is change likely or not? If unlikely, what structural or cultural interventions can we design to try to change the situation? An example of a prescriptive research project might be about encouraging teachers to adopt learner-centered strategies. A typical research question might sound like this: what changes in the ranking and promotion system might incite teachers to experiment with innovative, non-traditional teaching methods? Using Archer's language, we want to achieve a morphogenetic outcome in pedagogy. So we are looking for specific structural changes that we can introduce to shift the situational logic to one of opportunity, for instance. How can we tweak the opportunity costs of innovation? For example, if the system is designed to police the teachers and detect deviation, or promotion is based on compliance, innovation might be considered pretty unsafe and counterproductive. If the workload of the teachers is quite high, there may be no time to reflect on and innovate their practice. Would providing incentive for action research and earmarking time for teachers to design their classes be adequate structural changes to promote pedagogical innovation? In this lecture, we talked about concrete and practical ways of using Archer's morphogenetic approach in our investigations of the social world. We've said that because the social world is inherently and stubbornly an open system, we need to pay close attention to the interactions between causal mechanisms. For this reason, we spent some time examining the interplay between structure and culture because we encounter so many cases when these two interact as they condition agency. We also talked about 4 general types of realist social investigations based on the type of research questions we ask: the historical, the diagnostic, the comparative, and the prescriptive. Let me be clear that this list is intended only to be illustrative and not exhaustive. For sure, a researcher can adopt other research objectives. The hope, however, is that by discussing concrete examples of research questions, we can see how using Archer's morphogenetic approach as an interpretive lens can help us sharpen our research and increase its rigor, guiding us in our task of describing and explaining social phenomena. Now, it may strike some of us that the morphogenetic approach, at least as interpreted here, is overly technical and tedious, if not quite overwhelming, particularly to the novice. Let me respond first by saying that mine is but one of several possible interpretations. By no means am I canonizing it as the only one or even a completely correct one. It is more than anything else my personal attempt to make sense of the morphogenetic approach. Like you, I remain a student of Margaret Archer at heart, always learning something new each time I sink my teeth into her texts. The morphogenetic approach, which Margaret Archer herself in her last years agreed to call a method, provides us an ontological map that serves as a guide for navigating the stratified social world. By no means does it supply the answers to our questions, but like every good map, it tells us what to look for as it lays out the terrain that we want to explore, including its hidden topography, reminding us that what we encounter today are simply the landmarks left behind by those who have walked before us.